Cynthia Hammer, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, Katie.
This is I feel like you are I call anyone diagnosed in the 20th century a unicorn, especially women. I feel like there it was few and far between back in the 90s. So I would love to hear your story in terms of your diagnosis first. It was back in 92 and your son was diagnosed first, correct?
Yes.
But he was diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, which I find interesting because I feel like that's also quite rare for a boy to get diagnosed with inattentive, especially 30 years ago. Was that rare at the time?
I can't really say the doctor said you have inattentive ADHD, but from my reading the literature and observing him, that's what I thought he fit into more, you know.
Yeah.
So it's not like, and even now when you talk to women, they say, well, I don't know what type I am. So it's not like the doctors give you a label that you're one type or another. But and I always felt that getting diagnosed with inattentive type is a little more complicated because it's not as clear. I mean, when you're physically hyperactive and you're high energy, those things are just more observable. They're more tangible. But the
Mm.
other ones are a little more, I'd say, almost loosey goosey in a way. So sometimes I'd look at my son and say, yes, this describes him. And other times I'd look at him and say, no, it doesn't. So it took several years before we decided he needed to go get diagnosed. And the only thing that really spurred it was he was in elementary school in a single classroom and he was going to move on to middle school. And without understanding why, we just knew he'd get lost in a school of that size. So we decided
Mm.
to send him to private school. And even there, when he was one of 12 children, the gym teacher was telling us how he'd be in gym class looking at the ceiling and he was playing soccer and he'd be looking at studying clover in the grass when the ball was coming up. And even though he was good when the ball came near him, the parents would get all agitated, shouting at him, the ball's coming your way, pay attention. So there were things like that going on in his life that made us think he had this type of ADHD. And for myself, again, off and on, I would say, "Oh, I do that like Brian." I those are things I do. So I'd be wondering about it. And where I was working, I finally got evaluated by my supervisor. I was a social worker, and she had a grandchild that had been diagnosed with ADHD. So when she evaluated me, she said, "You do some things well." She said, "You're hard to evaluate because you do some things well and other things not so well." And then she went on to talk about some things I did that she wondered why I did because they really weren't in my area of my job responsibilities. And when she said those things, I honestly said, I don't know why I did those things. And I said to her, I think I have ADHD. And she said, I think so too. So she was the one that really got me to go back the next time I visited with my son's pediatrician. And I've been going to see him for 2 years, accompanying my son. I said to the doctor, I said, I think I have ADHD. And he said, you do. So
Didn't hesitate.
well, no, and that was the thing, you start wondering, what is it that people see about me that I don't know about myself, but somehow the way I come across. So when I wrote my book, I just said I can only speculate that I would get restless when the topic got boring, or I would interject with something that was off topic, or that when he was ready to leave the room, I suddenly had a lot of things I wanted to tell him. I mean, those are the kind of behaviors I think an ADHD person would have. So I only can imagine I was doing those things, and that's what made him think I had ADHD. But when I got diagnosed, I I thought I was the only adult in the U.S. that knew, and it was very shame based for me, very lonely. And then I found a book in the library by Lynn Weiss, and it was about adult ADD. And I found a woman in Bellingham, Washington. We went to the first conference for adults. It was held in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Terry Matlin was there, and Sari Solden was there, and Dr. Haller was there, and they had all been diagnosed like 3 years earlier. So I was not the first one to the party. There were other adults who had known. And what the thing with Dr. Hallowell, and I don't know at what point he said this, but he said, I was never ashamed to say I had ADHD. So when I went back to Tacoma, we decided to start a support group, just a small one, which didn't work out. So then we switched and started a larger one in an auditorium. And I had to sit in my car and practice saying I have ADHD because that's what I wanted to do when I opened the meeting. I wanted to be able to say that. And it was, I just kept having a shaky voice, a tearful voice, but I kept having Dr. Hallowell's image of how you need to be able to say it with comfort. And so that's what I achieved. And after that, of course, I was working in a field then where it was perfectly acceptable and I didn't have to worry about my job if I was telling people I had ADHD. But I it just became a very easy thing to do. So
Mhm.
what I wanted to say is even leaving the ADHD conference, I don't usually talk to people on my seatmates on the plane, but this woman was playing Sudoku and I was just asking her about it. One thing too led to another. And I ended up telling her I had ADHD. And she said she had gotten diagnosed a week earlier.
You're kidding. Oh,
No, I'm
wow.
not. And so, but the thing was, which is the sad point, which I've encountered, is she had been seeing her psychiatrist for 2 years. And she had been tried on several medications for depression and anxiety. And I had read earlier, Dr. Dodson said that women typically experience 6 medications before someone decides, oh, this is attention deficit disorder. So she was the first person that I really heard from who had experienced that, going through that process of elimination where they start out thinking it's depression, or they keep saying, oh, it's anxiety, we just haven't found the right medication yet, and then eventually deciding it's ADHD. So she had only been on medication for a week and she wasn't angry at her psychiatrist, but I'm thinking the more she knows about her ADHD and the better she functions, she'll be upset at those 2 lost years.
Oh,
Or
I
all those
know.
years. 28 years, actually, because she's 28 years old.
Yeah, I was diagnosed at 45, and it is something we've talked about on the podcast a lot, that grief of, what if only, how did nobody see this, right? Especially I think when I was first diagnosed, looking at my report cards, the signs were everywhere.
Yeah.
And how, and then you can't help but wonder, like, how would my life have been different had I known? And yeah, but at the same time, feeling like, I think one of the things we benefit from having a diagnosis nowadays, as opposed to 30 years ago, is the fact that it's so much more widespread. There's so much less of that shame and stigma. It felt so freeing to get that diagnosis more than anything. Which,
Well, and they can find more people. The online community is wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know if you encountered this, but people that get into the field, they actually say, I'm glad I have ADHD because I relate to my clients, relate to my patients better.
Yeah.
That it's helpful that way.
Yeah, I actually, I could probably count on one hand the number of people I've met who work in the ADHD field and don't have ADHD because I'm like, are
Oh,
you
yeah.
sure?
Yeah. Well, Yeah, Ari Tuckman. I was trying to interview men and women that had the inattentive type, and I thought because of the way he comes across, he had inattentive. He said he didn't even have ADHD.
You're kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
I don't. I mean, it's not significant. It's not important. And I wonder if Sharon Shalene has ADHD. You know.
she's sort of on the fence. I think she
Oh,
questions.
oh,
Officially, she doesn't, but I know
oh.
I know she's. I know it's definitely she questions it. Um, so yeah. So tell me about the interviews. Were the interviews were for the book, or was it for a new project that you're working on?
When I first I guess I don't remember the timeline. You know, we're not good at that. But anyway, I set out to interview 25 men that had inattentive type because I had heard that boys had inattentive type as well as girls. So that was the first thing I did is interviewed, found 25 men through online and interviewed them, and it was really um, they had a lot of the same emotions, a lot of the same experiences as the women who have inattentive ADHD. And then recently, I decided to interview 25 women with the combined type because it, I get concerned when we all get lumped together. You know, they say girls are underdiagnosed. And
Mhm.
so are the girls who are hyperactive underdiagnosed, or is it just the girls that have inattentive type? So the women I diagnosed, they all were combined type, and very few of them were diagnosed as children. They said that they were hyperactive, but they suppressed it. There was so much cultural
Mhm.
messaging that they would, you know, move a foot around. They would get up out of their chair, sharpen their pencil. They would, one woman said, I bit the inside of my cheek so I wouldn't move. So they weren't identified either. And after we learned that, our organization now is more concerned that all children get diagnosed for, you know, we're broadening because we realize it's not just the inattentive that gets overlooked. I think the only ones that really get recognized are the ones who are physically hyperactive and disruptive in the classroom. And I like to think that it's because people don't know what to look for. And if we educate them more about what to look for, as you were saying, the signs were all there for you and no one was noticing. And
Mhm.
so there's too much of the concept that you have to have this physical hyperactivity. And even the women I interviewed, they said, I just never realized there were these other ways that it presented, that it would cover how I am. So a lot of that is just education.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about William Dodson was that he refers to the H as hyper arousal often instead of hyperactivity, which is something I relate
Ah,
much more to because when my therapist first suggested I had ADHD, I immediately thought, um, I'm not hyperactive, right? A lot of women don't think of themselves as that little boy who can't stop moving.
yes.
But when I was going through the diagnosis process and talking about emotional dysregulation and how quickly we go from 0 to 100 with rage, right? Like that is a form of internalized hyperactivity. I just wouldn't have known that. I wouldn't have known to label it. And something about the term hyperarousal just really kind of feels all
Oh,
encompassing about the emotional element of hyperactivity.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now what are the signs? Because I think that's, one of the things. Both of my kids were diagnosed after me, and they're both while my son was diagnosed with combined, I do think he's much more inattentive than anyone in my family, but he's also 12. So it's kind of hard to, it's kind of hard to parse
Oh,
what is typical distractibility in a child versus what is actually, would fall under the disorder. But what are some of the signs that you recommend to either teachers or parents that might be beyond just, well, they're a kid, um,
what?
might be something to look into?
Well, when we've interviewed, we have a series of YouTubes where we've interviewed 25 adults who were diagnosed late in life. And we always ask them, could you have been identified earlier? And they tell us what kind of behaviors they had that could have clued people in. So there are the 9 symptoms in the DSM, but it's that I don't find that helpful enough. It doesn't get down into the nitty-gritty enough to really guide someone to it. And I like to say that it's a complex of behaviors. So you're not just saying one thing. Like you could say, oh, the child's really, really hyperactive, and maybe that means he has ADHD. But for the inattentive type, it's a lot more subtle signs. And people were saying, well, of course, being dreamy, the teacher's talking and I'm not aware of what she's talking about. I have to ask my classmates. I would not turn in my papers. I would not follow instructions. I wouldn't turn over and do the back side of the paper. I would submit my paper without putting my name on it. I didn't always follow the instructions. Um, there's So we were going to make a list of all these complex of behaviors that the children would demonstrate. But the other thing I think is a big key is the teacher knows normal childhood development. And if she looks at the class as a bell curve, and I think the children that are off the end of the bell curve are the ones that she should be paying attention to and be thinking, what's going on here, that this child is kind of off the bell curve. And what was I going to say? So when they're off the bell curve, and what Orrin Mason said is, what happens is at the start of the school year, the teacher is usually looking at her classroom and saying, oh, that's the child that I'm going to have to pay attention to. That's the one that might need to be referred. They're kind of assessing their classroom. And he said during that period is when the inattentive child is perfect. The situation is new. They're trying their best to pay attention in school. They're not disruptive. Maybe they're following instructions. So later on, the teacher doesn't have that assessment mode going on. She's just gotten used to the child being that way. So I thought that was really a good insight, that we ought to alert the teachers to go back and look at children a little bit later after they get adjusted to the classroom, when it's not such a new situation, and be looking out for the children who often seem to be a little bit out in left field. Their eyes are looking out the window when you want them to be looking at the blackboard. They're talking to their neighbors. Some said I was a big talker because that's the only way I could pay attention, to keep something engaged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I hadn't thought about it before, but I wonder if the fact that we are those really excitable type A or A plus students at the very beginning,
Uh,
is that why we so often get those messages like, you're not meeting your potential, you have so much potential? Some of those messages that so many of us received that were so damaging to our sense of self-concept. I wonder if it's because they saw that really high performing version of ourselves right out of the gates and we can't sustain that.
oh, maybe, but I think too that because of your interest, sometimes you do have that high performing. It
Yeah.
continues to be there sometimes. When people said, if the subject interests me, I was really good, and others didn't, I wasn't. Some people said, I was always a good student. I was. I was under pressure to be a good student. It was important me to be a good student. Other people told me that I was so bright, it was easy to be a good student. So sometimes being a good student masked that they had problems. How
Yeah.
much effort they put in, how much anxiety it cost them, how hard they were trying to be the perfect child.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I didn't realize that was what ADHD also looked like in adulthood until I started interviewing women and found the vast majority of the women I was interviewing were very, very good students who then ended up diagnosed with depression and anxiety because of that perfectionism and because of that high, desire
Yeah.
to mask and show up and, really feeling like they were white knuckling it through so many situations and then falling apart at home. And yeah. Go ahead.
Well, that's what some of the women I interviewed, they figured it out during COVID,
Same.
because before that, the way they managed their life was to stay super busy. If they weren't super busy, it all fell apart. Being super busy forced them to be organized and stay on top of things. But once they didn't need to do that during COVID, that's when, I mean, maybe they realized it before. I think everyone I've talked to who has ADD said, I always knew I was different. They knew, but they didn't know why or how.
Mhm.
And during COVID, they watched Instagram, watched TikTok, and that's when they figured it out. So,
So speaking of COVID, so you founded the ADD Resources. It was a website, or was an organization, or a nonprofit?
when back in 1992, when um, my mother gave each of her daughters $2,000, and I decided to start a nonprofit back then. So I learned how to do it and did the paperwork. We started a nonprofit. Initially, it was called Adult Support of Washington, with the ADD. You
Uh-huh.
know, but when you said Adult Support of Washington, no one got the, I don't know. It was back then we called it ADD. We didn't call it ADHD. So it was called
Right.
Adult Support of Washington, but it's only if you read it, you knew what we were talking about. So eventually we changed the name to ADD Resources. And that was a nonprofit that we had based in Tacoma for 15 years. And we would have workshops, and it was all in person. We had
Mhm.
monthly meetings with the speaker, and then we had conferences. We had Dr. Hallowell come, Dr. Rady, all those people that, are the like the grandfathers of ADD now. They came and presented. So I ran that nonprofit for 15 years, and then I retired. I I trained as a coach, but I don't know, I wasn't successful. I wasn't successful as a coach. So then I just stopped. And during COVID, started to write a book. And in learning about ADHD again, I read a story of a 23-year-old girl. She wrote a blog on attitude, just saying she was so angry
Mm.
because people had seen she had some challenges. She got referred for help, and no one recognized her ADHD. So she's only 23 years old, but she's already so angry. And she said, people tell me just to move on now that go forward and make your life the best it can be. But she said, I can't. I'm just stuck in being angry. So somehow that resonated with me, and I decided to start another new nonprofit, which is the Inattentive ADHD Coalition. And this one is only virtual. It's only online. It's such a different world. And it's kind of fun to learn all of it.
I know, right? It's so what made you decide to write the memoir in COVID? You were just kind of looking for a project?
Well, yes, I had received my roommate after college went and married someone in Australia, and she lived on a sheep farm, and she was in charge of a piggery. She wrote a memoir for her children, and I had just received it. Right in Washington State, we were isolated and we had to stay home. So I got that. I said, well, I've never really talked to my children about my life. In an ADD family, you never seem to get around to that. There's always other stuff. So I thought, well, tell them about my life and what I did. And so I wrote that. And then I thought it was pretty good, but I read online. I was just planning it for them. But I read online that you should have someone else evaluate it. So I hired this developmental editor, and he threw out, I had written 55,000 words, and he threw out 15,000. He said, this is about your life with inattentive ADHD. And so he helped me to structure the book. He said, it's supposed to be a hero's journey where, stuff goes wrong, stuff goes wrong. And I said, yeah, that's true. That's how it went. And then, things improve and you come out, looking like a butterfly, I guess. So that's what happened. And as part of that, I also heard that an author should have a platform. So those two things coming together, thinking I wanted to start this nonprofit and the author should have a platform, that's what got me to do the Inattentive ADHD Coalition. And the thing I didn't realize, well, it was a process to find a publisher for the book. And when I signed the contract, I did not realize it would be 2 years before the book was published. I mean, I kept thinking that they want me to die before the book comes out. But it was also helpful, really, that it delayed because I kept writing, and some of that writing also got incorporated into the book that made it, I think, more relevant because I discovered Reddit. I had more up to date knowledge. And in the meantime, I had befriended Dr. Stephen Ferrone. And so he read my book and he made a few changes for it. Um, and then he said that I should include information about ADHD. So at the end of each chapter, I included a myth and correcting information for the myth. So my book is a memoir about my life, but it's actually a self-help book. I asked a friend, what category do you think this is in? She said self-help, because I showed how I helped myself before there was coaching, before there was therapy, there was just medication. The books I read and the things I did that enabled me to start a nonprofit and run a nonprofit.
Wow. Amazing. Just come
Well,
out of retirement in a big way then, huh?
well, I didn't know. You don't know. It's. I think that a lot of us have that. We have an idea and we pursue it, and it's like you're on a big wave, and look where it's taking you, Katie. You never envisioned this, but there it goes.
I know, absolutely. I always talk about this. I just wanted to have some conversations with some women, and I accidentally started a business. I always joke that we don't have hobbies. We start new businesses. That's how you know you have ADHD.
Uh-huh.
Now, one of the things the subtitle of the book is the circular staircase, right? It's I'm sorry, I'm just looking at
You're
that. Climbing the
climbing.
circular staircase. What is the circular staircase? What does that mean?
Well, when I think when people see the cover of my book, they relate to the image. But where I tell people is you acquire one skill, and that's going up one step. And you acquire another skill, that's going up another step. So each step takes you up and around and up and around until you're at the top.
I love that. Yeah. Okay. Um, That's really interesting. And I really do relate to that visual. I think it's a great visual for the way in which small steps can be so important in this journey. And it's one of those things that we slowing down and taking those one step at a time is not something I think many of us are naturally good at.
And I don't know if people succeed any other way, but I
Mm.
think that's how I succeeded. And my first step, you could be embarrassed to tell a neurotypical person this, but my first step was to put my credit card back in my wallet.
Mm.
My second step was to put my keys back in my purse. The third step was to put my purse at a certain place in my house when I came in the house. And just those little things started to give me confidence that you could manage your environment and manage yourself.
Mm. That's lovely. Now, what are some of, now you had talked about when you first received the diagnosis that you did feel a lot of shame about it. You did feel very lonely at the time because it was 30 years ago. But Hallowell and others really brought you to a place of moving past that shame. Is there something looking back that was really helpful mindset shift for you in terms of being more comfortable living out loud with ADHD?
I don't think you can just talk yourself into improved self-esteem. You have to work your way into improved self-esteem, and that's by improving how you function. And as you improve how you function, as I said, you're climbing the circular staircase, you get that feedback that you're better.
Hmm.
And so I don't think it's just saying the words, but I do think it's really helpful to stop saying bad words to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to stop saying anything negative about yourself. And the book that helped me with that was Learned Optimism. So when something bad goes wrong, you're more focused on how can I change it for the future. And when something good goes right, you keep saying what you did that made it go right. So there's ways you can talk to yourself that help you to build up your self-esteem. But it's not like, the thing where they praise young children for just participating. And, you have to build your self-esteem on something that's real. So you need to be making some achievements that you're proud of. So when I first was diagnosed, because, you wonder, how do people see that I have this? I thought I had the letter A embroidered on my clothing, which stood for ADHD. Everyone could see that I had ADHD. Everyone knew. And it was like, I just didn't like it, but then as I got on medication and people were saying, "Did you see how Cynthia did such and such?" Or the change in her, that people were starting to build me up. Do you know what I mean? The way they
Mm-hmm.
interacted me was different. So uh, it just, as I said, it builds on each thing builds on other things. It's like building blocks.
Now,
Like,
one of the oh, go ahead. Keep going.
well, no, recently I was on a podcast where she talks about the chrysalis, that you're in your cocoon and you come out as a butterfly. And I said, yes, that's true with ADHD, but you shouldn't think that it's going to happen in 30 days. I think it happens in 3 to 5 years, and only with effort.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I often feel like it's one of those games like Shoots and Ladders where I feel like two steps forward,
Oh,
one step
forward and
back.
back. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
um, So no, I'm curious looking at this horizon of ADHD over the last few years, especially I was a pandemic diagnosis. I was diagnosed in
Oh,
2020 and it
wow.
was very similar to what you said. All of a sudden my kids were home, my husband was home, I was the chef, the teacher, the housekeeper, all of the things. And I felt, it was my house of cards really just fell apart during COVID. And it's just been such an explosion of diagnoses, awareness, TikTok, and it just feels like it's everywhere. And obviously it feels like it's everywhere because that's what I do full time. But
Yeah,
like,
well, you're
I'm
surrounded
curious,
by it.
right? I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, about the recent rise in information and talking about and the recent rise in diagnoses. Does it feel like this is a positive move, or do you feel is because I feel like sometimes it's mixed, right? A lot of people worry that we're talking, ADHD is going to be taken less seriously because everybody's rolling their eyes and saying, "Oh, everybody has ADHD now." That it might be taken less seriously. It might be looked at as something that isn't requiring a diagnosis, isn't requiring um that you, like you had said earlier, like it's fine, maybe you have it, maybe you don't, it's not a big deal. Anyway, I'm just rambling now. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the last couple years in this change in the climate.
Years ago, Dr. Phelan said his experience was most adults who thought they had ADD were right. And I
Mhm.
guess I go with that. And I think that where I'm coming from now is this is a condition we're born with, and the soonest it gets diagnosed, the better. And why are we being diagnosed with a condition when we're 50 that we had since birth?
Mhm.
We need better ways to diagnose it sooner because we know it gets more complicated and more damage happens when it doesn't get diagnosed when a child is 7. You know, the additional depression, the anxiety, the low self-esteem. We know that people with a undiagnosed ADHD are more at risk for suicide, more likely to get involved in substance abuse, divorce, all the bad things in life they're more likely to experience. And if they get diagnosed and treated, all those things are less. They're more comparable to a neurotypical person.
Mhm. Well said. Now, one of the things I hear a lot from women, especially older women who approach their doctors and say, "I think I might have ADHD," and they hear from their doctors, "Well, you've made it this far. What's the point in getting a diagnosis?" Is that something you've heard from at least postmenopausal women?
So, well, one woman wrote that online. She said about herself, she said, I think I have ADHD. I'm 50. Should I do anything about it? And I said, well, if you're content with your life, no. But if you want to grow and change and improve, go get your diagnosis. Because I personally don't think you can improve your life very much without knowing what you're dealing with.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
personally think that medication is a cornerstone. Medication and education are the cornerstones for improvement.
Amazing. Now, so I guess I like to ask, what is it that you love the most about your ADHD?
My first child died, I believe, because of my undiagnosed ADHD. We had been in the Peace Corps and we were supposed to take some pills when we came back home to prevent malaria. And when I unpacked the suitcase, I didn't put the pills in a safe place and she swallowed them. That was over 50 years ago. And when I learned about my ADHD, I said, I'll never be happy to know I have ADHD because now I understand why my daughter died. And so it's very hard for me to say what I celebrate about my ADHD. And I go with what Paul Chaffee says. I don't think it's a superpower, but there are hard won compensations. And I think my compensations, which I learned from Strength Finders 2, is of course um, ideation, having lots of ideas, having good ideas. And I'm realizing another strength I've had, which I was always too shy about, is building other people up. I love encouraging other people. And I think people with ADD are that way a lot. You know, they're very, well, they're in the fields where they try to help other people. That's just their nature to be very
Mhm.
helpful. So those two things could stand out for me, I guess. And along with that is creativity. I love to create the template for how something's going to be done. To figure out the steps, and this is working out the logic of it. And I think that is a part of an ADHD trait. And of course, the hyper focus, where when I was writing the book, you could get so involved in it and look up and say, oh, it's evening, and you had been so engaged in something that it was a wonderful experience. And when I give talks now, I like to tell people that ADHD can be so different for everyone because you can have as few as 5 symptoms and say you have ADHD. Some of the women I talked to had all 18 symptoms. Some of us have more severe symptoms than others. So it's already a different thing for all of us out of the starting gate. And then, depending on the family you're born into, that can make a big difference. I said, I grew up with a lot of structure. but I didn't have medication. And a lot of kids today grow up without the structure, but they get the medication. So which one is better? Which one is
Mhm.
better? I mean, we need both. And then you need, good diet and good rest and good nutrition. There's all these things that some of us we're more fortunate to have than others. So it's very hard when people come out and say ADD is a disorder and someone else says, no, it's a superpower. I just think it can be all things depending on the person and depending on where they are within their journey.
Mhm. Yes, well said. And I think I really the hard won compensations is a great way of saying that too, because there is so much pain in so many in our lives, and the diagnosis just feels like an opportunity to rewrite a lot of that pain. I would add to your list the ability to write your first book at what 78, um, which is a tremendous accomplishment, and so congratulations on that. Now, I loved on your blog you had talked about writing the book itself, and one of the things with inattentive ADHD is how difficult it is to do something like write a book. But you had a very measured approach to it, correct?
Well, you have to realize first that I don't have children anymore. I don't have a job. I have the whole day to spend how I want. And I had read once about someone trying to diet that if you're on your diet and you go off it one day, you don't say, well, I blew my diet, I better quit. You say, I went off it yesterday, I go back on it today. So when I made a commitment to write every day, I had that attitude that my goal is to write every day, but if I don't, that's not an excuse not to go back and write another day. And
Mhm.
so I think have some little bit of autism because I did like that kind of routine. Every morning I knew I was going to exercise and write. So that gave structure to these long days of being in the house. And the other thing was, I don't see it as available now, but there were these websites that would help you to write better. So I learned about how to write dialogue, that when you go into a new space, you're supposed to describe the space because you don't just bring someone into a room. So, we liked learning new things. So that was the fun part of it too, is learning and improving. And I had written before when we had the other nonprofit, we put out a monthly newsletter. So I had all those articles, and some of that got incorporated into the book because I wouldn't have remembered all that stuff, you know. And that was what was annoying working with the developmental editors. He wanted me to say which came first and which happened next, and I was just having. How old was my son at that time? Oh, that might have happened. And then that happened, and so yeah, there's some pressures on you to make it a certain way, but I'm very proud of the book.
Well, that's amazing, and I feel like such a great testament to what it looks like to retire with ADHD,
Oh,
which is the idea of sitting around and doing nothing in my retirement is agonizing. But I love the idea that you were able to start this new venture and this new book and this new resource and platform on your own time, and it sounds like you're having a lot of fun with it.
well, and if you meet, I, Dr. Hallowell's still out there. When I talked to him, he said, no, he's never going to give up. Terry Matlin says she's going to die doing what she's doing. Kathleen Nadeau is writing another book with Pat Quinn. I mean, Pat Quinn, I know, is in her 80s, and she was so eager to write another book. So, yeah, I just think being engaged is what gives us our spark, having
Right?
something
Yeah.
we love to do.
I know, and I've often that's been a way that I've been able to reframe my sense of learning too, because I didn't do well in all subjects at school. I really struggled in school a lot of the time in the classroom. But seeing the way in which we are lifelong learners is really inspiring.
Hmm.
To just have, yeah, like you said, have that engagement is great. Well, this has been so lovely. Thank you for sharing your story with me, Cynthia, and congratulations on the book. I'll certainly have links to that in the to your website and to the book in the episode show notes. Now, I'm curious if
Oh,
you
can
could.
we mention the name of the book?
Oh yeah, of course. Go ahead. It's
Um, the book is called Living with Inattentive ADHD, Climbing the Circular Staircase. Where I think the book is really helpful is not just for people with inattentive ADHD, but for your family members who they doubt you have ADHD or don't understand the broad impacts of it. Because at my age, I decided I have no secrets, I have no shame. So I tell you how many car accidents I did, how many items I lost that were expensive, how I left a son at preschool on a day it wasn't there, how I forgot to, all the things that we might be our hidden our hidden errors, I guess. I don't know what to call them, but I'm sure all of us have things that we wouldn't want other people to know. And those are the kinds of things I write about in the book. So your family would really understand there's a lot of things they don't know about you because you hide it.
I love the picture on your Instagram feed of you reading your own book with the barbecue on fire in the
Oh,
background.
oh, good. Oh, good.
It's such a great photo. And it is a nice way to kind of take some of the sting out of some of these behaviors. Yeah, it was great. So I'd love to find out if you had an alternate name for ADHD. Would you call it something else?
Um, I I am going to call it neurodivergent because
Excellent.
I think that's the direction we need to go in. You start hearing women say, "Oh, I have autism, I have ADHD, I have anxiety." I thought, this is like we're mongrels. We've got a little bit of everything, and it's nice to have your own tribe, but I think we're going to create a tribe of neurodivergent people, and that's when we're going to have much more power.
That's beautiful, and it does feel like we're definitely moving in that direction thanks to the internet and social media and the way in which we're able to find each other.
Right,
I think such a huge
right.
part of our treatment. The treatment plan around ADHD is finding each other and sharing our stories and feeling less alone,
Yes,
for sure.
yes.
So.
You're a big part of that. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for all the work that you are doing in this field, and yeah, I can't wait to see what else comes from Cynthia the next 10, 20
Well,
years.
I guess when our nonprofit is hoping to work on, we've decided we're going to focus on getting girls screened by age 7. And
Amazing.
the other thing we're saying is that whenever a child is diagnosed with ADHD, the screening should be recommended to the parents.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and so this is not my idea, but this was a powerful thing a woman told me at the ADHD conference. She thought in the hospital, when the mother gives birth to a baby, that's when they should be given the screen for ADHD. It's only an 18-question thing. It's available online, the ASRS. It's free. You can go look at it. But if mothers knew when they had a child that they might have ADHD, they'll have several years to get themselves ready before they might take on the child with ADHD, which I think is an awesome thing to think about. I mean, we want to change the future, but to fix things right now, if we could start finding the women when they're giving birth, and they give screens now, like, do you have postpartum depression? Do you have depression? They could just give this other screen along the way. That would make a
Mm.
big difference.
Gosh, I certainly know I would have liked that when I was pregnant, or having newborns. That was a really hard time, and I think it is for a lot of women, undiagnosed or diagnosed, having babies around the house. So it would have been a good time.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Cynthia. It's been really lovely.
Good. Thank you.